Good morning, good afternoon, bonjour à tout le monde et
Good
bienvenue.
morning, good afternoon. My name is Yves Deschênes. I'm responsible of the communications at the Religious Conference, Canadian Religious Conference. I'm welcome to this webinar. We're going to look at a few technical points now.
I'm the communication officer for the CRC, and I will tell you a little bit more about some technical point. You're probably used to the interpretation, but I just want to repeat that in the menu down your screen, at the bottom of your screen, you have the interpretation icon. I invite you to press this icon and select the audio you prefer. So, en français maintenant, je vous rappelle que pour
I
l'interprétation,
remind you for the interpretation that you go in the menu at the bottom of your screen, you select interpretation or interpretation, and you choose the channel you want, your preference in this English for your case. So if there's anything during the presentation, I ask you to use the chat, the dialogue that we use to be able to send us a message, and we will try. We are a few members of the team who will try to help you if there's any problems.
The presentation technical points, use the chat box, put your message, your request there, and we'll try to help you. Je vous remercie beaucoup de votre présence. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for your presence. Now, I would like to present to you our conference. Madame Geneviève Galland, she's the general director of the Office of the Congregation's Religious Congress for Integral Ecology. She participated last time at COP28. So today, as we presented it to you in the invitation, I would really like to see with you what would be the answers to the following questions. How's working the international negotiations for climatic situation? What's the follow-up? And how the congregations how can they participate to promote ecology, integral ecology, and of course, other subjects that belongs to her. So without no further ado, I wish you an excellent webinar, and here's Geneviève. Thank you, Yves.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really grateful to be with you and grateful that we're going to have this opportunity to look at COP28, how it went and where it's going and what's next for us. I've worked with ORCE for the last 2 years, and it's been a real honor and culmination for us to get to this point where we were participating as a delegate in COP28. I'm going to present today in English. But I am fully bilingual. I just recovered from COVID, so I've got a little bit of brain fog. So that's why I'm doing it only in English today for a presentation. But when we come to the questions and answers, I'd be happy to answer any questions in French as well. We are going to record today's presentation, and it'll be available on the CRC YouTube channel. So before we begin, I just want to thank the International Union of Superior Generals and the CRC for inviting ORCE to come and to speak to you all, because this is an excellent opportunity for us to share with you the work that we've been doing. You may have heard a little bit about ORCE, and this is an opportunity to learn a little bit more. So, I get my slides going. ORCE, we're based in Ottawa. It's the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology, an organization that is comprised of 24 different religious congregations that have joined over the last 2 years, providing funding and support and participation on the board as ORCE works to improve our opportunities for policy changes federally on ecological justice. With our work, ORCE has been very active with Climate Action Network. Climate Action Network was how we were invited to participate in this year's COP. So, what is a COP? When was the first COP? How did it come about and who attended? How are the locations chosen? So, what we're going to send our minds back to May of 1992, and that's when the convention was adopted. This was the first kind of framework convention on climate change, and it was adopted at the UN headquarters in New York. And you'll see up on the screen, there's a little, what else happened? Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years behind bars. So for me, it's just a reminder of the time and the place and the energy that we lived in that time, 1992. So after that initial text was created at the Earth Summit in Rio, that was the chance where different organizations could sign on. And the Convention on Climate Change had two sister conventions, those being the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention to Combat Climate Desertification. And that's important to notice because when we talk about COPs or Conference of Parties, there are actually three. And so while we talk about COP28, we're speaking about the Climate Convention, but there's also, now goodness, if I get this, the COP15, which was recently held in Canada, which was on biological diversity. Then you also have the ways we name our COPs based on which location. So for example, was it Kyoto? Was it Germany? Was it Lima? Okay, so with these COPs, we have regional groups. Regional group members decide which country is going to host it. So you see the graphic on top. It gives some examples of different places of where it was held. There are 5 different United Nations regional groups. There's an African group, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America and Caribbean, and then the Western European and others group. So for example, this past year with the COP in Dubai with the United Arab Emirates, that was part of the Asia Pacific group. Next year, the Eastern European group is meant to be in Azerbaijan, and the year following in Brazil on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean group. Alongside of this is how much space and what kind of capacity does the country have to host a conference of parties. You see in my second graphic this example of how many people were participating in these conferences of parties in 1995. You'll see in 2009 for COP15, that was the largest conference. It was a big jump from around 10,000 people to 26,000 people. And then when you're talking about the COP that just took place, we're looking at 84,000 people. Who attends? That's the other piece. We've got a whole range of folks, people who are working for the UN and the different clusters that are working on these files, but also environmentalists, unions, business representatives, municipal leaders often attend, but it is meant to be most of all state representatives and staffers to work on these treaties. Back to Canada. Canada was active in Kyoto, in the Kyoto Accord, leading up from 1992 to the Kyoto Accord. But in 2011, Canada was the first signatory to withdraw. And many of you may remember that. That was when Peter Kent was the environment minister, and he announced Canada's repudiation of the accord a day after the COP wrapped in Durban, South Africa. And the Durban talks, they were a time when we were really leading to a new binding treaty. It's a transition from non-binding to binding. And really, it was also a time when we were talking about money and the finances of what this would take. And that's important to name because I believe that directly contributed, I know it directly contributed to why Canada departed. The Durban talks were leading to a new binding treaty with targets for all countries that would take effect in 2020. You also may know that we often call this big agreement the Paris Agreement. It had a couple different names. It went from the UN framework to the Copenhagen Accord, to the Kyoto Accord, and then the Paris Agreement. So we've got this Paris Agreement. Canada's not in it. We had a conservative government, and it was I was working in the field of international development at that time, and it wasn't a very good time for international development neither. But you may remember this time period. This was when we had an election in 2015. I put this out not just to recognize the transition between different parties in our government, but there was a real energy around what we were doing. We had a rally in Ottawa that was the largest rally that had ever taken place in Canada and was the largest for the environment. And it was focused around this idea of it's 100% possible. So really to start to reinvigorate the environmental movement, to pull more people into the environmental movement. You'll see this is my photo with my Development and Peace team and Pope Francis. And everybody was excited because now it wasn't just the environmentalists. You also had the church. You also had young people taking to the streets. I remember in this protest, we had a lot of teachers and they were at their first protest. So that was a lot. It took place right across Canada. So it wasn't just in Ottawa. And this was a reinvigoration. So with that change of party in power, in April 2016, Canada then again signed the Paris Agreement. So that's where we were. You see just on the left that there are 3 major agreements on climate change, that we would limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees. Number 2, that we would review countries' commitments to cutting emissions every 5 years. And that piece you're going to hear me talk a lot about. And then 3rd, the climate finance for developing countries. Now, what we have here is a 5-year cycle. You see me, as I said, review countries' commitments to cutting emissions every 5 years. The idea is the treaty would have a 5-year cycle with increasingly ambitious climate action. And that was what we call the global stocktake. Now, I'd like to mention this because it makes me laugh, but I thought for the first while that they were talking about stockade, like you would contain horses in a stockade on a ranch. And it somehow made sense to me because you're pulling together all these, 195 countries and leaders, putting them in a room and trying to force them to take stock of what's happening. It wasn't a stockade, it was more of a stock taking. But this is an essential part of the Paris Agreement, that we would assess the world's collective progress. Where are we at? Are we going to achieve the Paris Agreement? You remember I said it was supposed to start being binding in 2020. Now, at the same time, we know what happened globally between 2020 and today, an increased sense of globalization, but also the pandemic, which disrupted some of the ways that we worked. It also brought forth some of the ways that we are connected, and I am hopeful that more people were able to see and make the connections between natural disasters, the increase of the divide between the rich and the poor, the pandemic, and also a weakening democracy. So with this global stocktake, that was the big thing for COP28 this year. We wanted to really see a political signal sent out that would show us where we're at, what were the gaps, what were the shortcomings, and to draw conclusions about an ambitious way forward. And this is important to keep in mind because when we set this Paris Agreement, what were folks thinking? What did they think would happen in 5, 10, or 15 years in the future? And here where we are today, drawing back to the title of today's conference, is Transforming Multilateralism. How's it going with this stocktake? Is it working? What do we need to improve? And that recognizing the need to go much further, as we see in Pope Francis's Laudate Deum on transforming multilateralism. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown on how it went. How did it go with COP28? COP28, this I put a sentence up here because I think it summarizes how it went, but also gives an indication of the challenges within it. COP28 was a complex event that showcased both the progress and the challenges inherent in global climate negotiations. So in political speak, The summit really underscored a need for greater ambition and a more robust response to the influence of big polluters. At no point in my presentation this far have I talked about the Paris Agreement being about the objective being about bringing together the oil and gas and fossil fuel lobby or companies to the table. This was meant to be states and a global response. Not to dismiss the importance of bringing together private support and community support, but it wasn't the point. And now we have COP28 with an epic oil and gas industry involvement. It's been the biggest COP in terms of participation. There's been up to 85,000 people. And the one previous only had 46,000, so it was about half that. There was an incredible amount of industry presence and greenwashing. One example is that there was a real promo on solar panels for luxury yachts. And the future for yachting was solar panels. Now, this was bizarre considering the 300 largest yachts or boats have the equivalent greenhouse gas emissions to 10 million people. So you've got this huge disconnect where you've got small island states speaking about what's happening to their people, their land, and in fact, they're disappearing. And then at the same time, don't worry, you can still yacht with your buddies because we have solar panels. So it was an example of some of the disconnect that happened. There was a pavilion entirely devoted to Canada's fossil fuels. There was a big shout out for Alberta, but not a lot of people showed up to those events. So there was a lot of kind of promo of Canadian fossil fuels. And it's good that they were there, but that wasn't what people were really interested in. And then lastly, we have talked about the importance of a broad participation and virtual delegates. So I was there as a virtual delegate, but I was limited in my participation. And this was a big disappointment. I can speak to it a bit afterwards, but there was the impression given that my participation would be greater and I would be less of an observer or just someone watching from afar. And that's particularly upsetting because the official sustainability report for COP27 said that the event resulted in 63,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we've got more people, more yachts, and yet we didn't have an increased capacity for virtual participation, which to me is honestly ridiculous considering what we've learned over the last 3 years about how to do things like webinars that we're doing today. So what worked? What was delivered at this COP? What COP delivered was a strong political signal that the fossil fuel era needs to end, and we have to transition away from fossil fuel energies. This is a really hopeful outcome internationally and will impact Canada and all of us. This is a political signal the fossil fuel era needs to end. So everybody's on board. We're moving away, a transition away from fossil fuel energies. Was there the lingo people necessarily wanted? Maybe not. But it's clear that the decision text needed to have specific wording about this transition away. We know that fossil fuels are by far the largest contributor to global climate change, and to explicitly name it and name the need for a phase out forces the world to recognize the end of this era. I've repeated it about 3 or 4 times because I think it has to be repeated and repeated. And COP28 also gave us a clear indication of the timeframes. This has to happen in the current decade, and we must achieve net zero emissions globally by 2050. Is it going to be enough? We don't know. That depends on whether we're really able to limit the kind of loopholes and qualifiers that have been allowing for ongoing expansion of coal, oil, and gas projects. What did COP28 fail to deliver? It failed to deliver a clear no on dangerous distractions. This is where we're talking about carbon capture technology and these kinds of projects. the final text unfortunately opened a door to numerous technologies that can really seriously risk our efforts to move away from fossil fuels. And it threw in other text concepts that are a bit vague, like transition fuels and zero emission energy systems. What was missing also was a lack of commitment to predictable grant-based support for developing countries. The absence of financial commitments from developed countries, in particular on their climate finance obligations, is a major obstacle to implementing the COP28 decisions, and really can weaken and has weakened the consensus that's been reached. Lastly, we need differentiated signals. Developed countries must take the lead. While only 5 developed countries are responsible for the majority of oil and gas expansion projects by 2050, the COP decision is silent on developed countries' responsibilities. The responsibility historically and currently, of which Canada is a big part, that responsibility to phase out fossil fuels first, and to me, using the brakes in order to achieve a just and equitable global energy transition. So what's some better news, Jen? Courage is contagious. During the summit, 4 new countries joined the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This was really exciting. And here I have a quote on the slide, and I'm going to read it because it actually reminds me a lot of what we heard in Laudato Deum from Pope Francis. We are confronted with a struggle between fossil capital and human life, including the life of our planet, and we must choose a side. And any person anywhere in the world would understand that the only stance to take is in favor of life. Today, within the broader scope of humanity, being on the side of life means being alongside you, the people who are on the verge of disappearing on the islands due to extensive carbon consumption by a small elite of humanity. And so this was President Gustavo Petro of Colombia. That is a big, big deal. This is not just Pope Francis talking. This is the leader of our country recognizing that life is central when we're talking about fossil fuels, and recognizing the importance of solidarity with the small island states. So President Gustavo of Colombia also recently met with the Vatican to rally more support for the treaty. And really, we're hopeful that the Vatican can be a uniting moral force to help garner more world leaders to join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to really accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. The central aim of the Paris Agreement is to strengthen the global response to the threat, and this Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is part of that. Okay, what else happened? ORCE set up 3 areas of focus that we wanted to follow for COP28. And these are 3 areas that we communicated to Catherine Stewart, the Climate Change Ambassador of Canada, who we communicated with regularly, as well as the Minister of Natural Resources and the Minister of the Environment. So we want to see fossil fuel phase out of domestic and internationally, which means no new oil and gas. We want to see capping emissions in Canada. And we want to see ecological reparations, loss and damage financing. I'm going to tell you a bit of how that went. Okay, so with the fossil fuel phase out, one of the things we got was the phasing out of fossil fuel in the text. We got it. This is the first time, as I mentioned, that the COP acknowledges and agrees to address the main cause of climate crisis and send a signal on this front. The challenge is that Canada is continuing to expand its fossil fuel oil and gas projects. And we really want to see Canada keep with the science and reach the net zero by 2050. And that will mean a reduction, stopping a cap on the production, and then a reduction. But it is still a big deal that 140 countries agrees on a fossil fuel phase out. We do need to make sure that this naming and this text is addressed along with these production cap reports, which is really letting people know which are the countries that are still expanding and still digging and still withdrawing fossil fuels. We want to see a capping of emissions in Canada. So this is what we wanted Canada to finally present, a strong cap on oil and gas emissions, which has been years overdue. And this was a little bit fun. There was a cap, my cap on emissions. We have a picture of Elizabeth May, but this came out in the media. The desire of civil society was to push Canada to get going on this oil and gas emissions cap. So it went well. The first draft of the policy, it wasn't expected. Everybody was quite depressed about it, but it did come out during the COP. And there's a renewed interest in the political will needed on a kind of whole of government system in order for this oil and gas emissions cap to work. It's not, the framework isn't enough to tackle everything, but it is starting the process. We have to improve our goals. We need an increased reduction, and we want to see a reduction of 40 to 50%. Right now, the proposed emission reduction is 16 to 20%. So what we're going to see in the coming days and weeks is Canada putting forward the further details on these emissions cap. And this is an opportunity for us to step up and recognize and name that we need to go further in our emissions caps. The third, loss and damage financing. You'll see here I use the word ecological reparations. This is new language, but it's an important language because it can twig our imagination and our creativity. Ecological reparations. We know what reparations is. What would ecological reparations look like? So what we need is clarity on the financing, and that's really funding for the loss and damage fund. And that's separate from finance that is adaptation and mitigation. So you see on the screen, there's two ways you can see this. One is, in a depressing way, there's no agreement on how this energy transition is going to be funded. Or we can celebrate the establishment of the loss and damage fund, that it's a historic agreement that has so far generated almost 800 million in pledges. Personally, I think 800 million in pledges is nothing, is like a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the ocean. What we talk about needing, or what vulnerable countries will need to deal with climate-related damages, is we need about 580 billion, which is a far, far cry from where we are. But again, positively, loss and damage is now being recognized as the third pillar of climate policy, that we have mitigation, that we have adaptation, and now we have loss and damage. So that's an exciting advantage. There's going to be work in the coming year and leading up to the next two COPs focused on the success of the loss and damage fund. And that I thought we could circle back a little bit more when we do the questions and answers, because that'll be kind of the next piece. The good news and bad news. Some of the bad news that comes from COP is that the more we have fossil fuel extraction, the more we have loss and damage. So you can talk about loss of damage and funding, but we really need that equitable transition away from fossil fuel production. That's the major disappointment. And that's the disappointment that was most present for the most marginalized folks, the small island states and the folks in developing countries. The other piece of bad news was the horror that was happening in Gaza. So this was happening, I'm gonna say right around the corner, but so close by, it was almost bizarre to have folks flying in, spending ridiculous amounts of money, to be in Dubai, which was a space, there was very little space for civil society and for protest. The quote, what's on the screen is a quote from Climate Action Network International, which was speaking to the horror of you had money for COP28 and you had money to support a war on Gaza, but the occupation and recognizing the horror of occupation, what's happening to the Palestinian people, wasn't being addressed. Recognizing there's no peace without justice, no climate justice without human rights. So that was bad news. But for me, it's also good news in the sense that there's a link between climate justice and human rights, which is at times hasn't necessarily been there, but has come out through this more recent gathering of international negotiators. Now, we have a situation where almost every country and company sees itself in a unique position as the future last producer of fossil fuels. No fossil fuel company really has a plan for phasing out fossil fuels. Very few countries actually have a plan for how they're really going to phase out fossil fuels. Everybody actually expects to continue extracting coal, oil, and gas far into the future, far beyond what's needed to cut emissions. Everybody wants to be the cleanest or the best carbon offset, and every country has their own reason why they should be the last ones. This is a difficult time where nations are rushing to gain the upper hand and market share before the world turns more solidly towards renewables. And there's a rush to produce while the social license remains somewhat intact. And this is the crucial part for faith groups. 30 faith institutions joined a global divestment announcement on this day. This is where faith institutions are naming that there is no more social license to continue to produce. When we talk about reconfiguring multilateralism, we're talking about what Pope Francis has called for, which is a multilateralism from below, one that is not simply determined by the elites of power. So faith-based organizations were involved in COP28. This is the good news. What were we looking for? This was the first of its kind. So the UN is recognizing, there's a new acronym, FBOs, faith-based organizations, that they're an important presence at COP and that it demonstrates the religious and spiritual communities are essential to the fight. And this connects back to that social license. That's pretty exciting. We have Pope Francis, who's speaking about loss and damage and ecological reparations. The Global Faith Leaders Summit produced an interfaith statement for COP28. This was kind of exciting. There were a number of faith communities who signed up, 28 faith leaders. Sadly, when I was looking at the picture and doing my research, there were only 3 women as part of these 28 faith leaders. So that signals for me that when we talk about what it means to have a multilateralism from below and not simply by the elites of power, there needs to be the presence of women as active participants. So we do have a way forward. And that way forward is really about disrupting the status quo. We have a COP. This is we have a COP that took place in Dubai. Is that where the political will is being developed for climate change mitigation? I don't believe so. I think we have this opportunity in our own home country to take action, but we also have opportunities for when we gather together. So COP30, so in 2 years' time, is going to be in Brazil. This is going to be in 2025. This is going to be 10 years after, I'm getting my years right, the Paris Agreement. But it's going to be an opportunity to really mobilize people. And with Brazil, we have the Amazon, we have the indigenous people, we have marginalized communities, and we have fossil fuel producers. So there's this kind of new energy that comes from location. I looked at an analysis of how the location for the Conference of Parties directly contributed to outcomes. For example, UAE, what did we expect when we have COP28 in Dubai? What do we expect when we have the president of the state oil and gas as the chair of COP28. What do we expect when COP29 is in Azerbaijan? The latest news was they had no women on the team, but don't worry, they added a few. What do we expect going forward? Is that going to be the space? People argue that Azerbaijan has worse human rights violations than Dubai or UAE. So what are we going to do as we kind of go forward? So there's energy around COP30 in 2025. That's something we can kind of work with. As well, we work domestically. We know that unless citizens control political power, it's not going to be possible to control damage for the environment. Where do we go from here? In Canada, since 2011, no federal government has implemented an intergovernmental long-term cohesive energy plan. We've had division with the provinces. We've had division with political parties. And this has been a real barrier to us moving forward. But if the citizens are controlling political power, if we build that social license for change, if we build that up, we have an opportunity to push the Canadian government to develop a cohesive energy plan that caps fossil fuel productions. So that's a way forward for us. The result that we received this year would have been unheard of 2 years ago, especially at a COP meeting in a petrostate. And it shows that even oil and gas producers can see we're headed for a fossil-free world. And this progress is really a large part due to the momentum built by tremendous people power. During COP28, the BBC leaked on how the UAE was going to target 15 countries, Canada included, to make oil and gas deals during COP28. And, while depressing that is, what it did name is that the OPEC oil cartel had warned its member countries with utmost urgency that pressure against fossil fuels may reach a tipping point with irreversible consequences at COP28. So the goal then for them was to stop talking about capping emissions and capping production, but to focus on carbon capture. For us, what we need to do is to combine our forces for integral ecology, to really build capital in our religious and social communities to fight for strengthened democracy in Canada with a production cap on oil and gas. We want to also look at things like conflict of interest, the conflict of interest that exists between states and corporations, greenwashing by corporations. And we want to look at divesting from supporting fossil fuels. And that's really important because what we're seeing amongst younger people is the social license is no longer there for them, and they're interested in divestment. So people need to see a new kind of way forward, a new way forward that disrupts the status quo, that recognizes the people have had enough, capitalism isn't working, and that we have an opportunity to control the damage for the environment. ORSI, one of the ways we do that through ORSI is through our learning and lobby days. So ORSI believes in renewed dialogue with all our members of parliament. We're working federally about how we shape the future of our planet. We're going to be having an upcoming lobby day on March 21st in Ottawa. We've developed a learning and lobbying process to make it easier for the leaders of religious congregations to join. We have small teams that meet with MPs and senators on Parliament Hill. What we do is we start with Monday, March 18th with an online webinar and some reading. And then in Ottawa in person on Wednesday, we do training on advocacy and on some of these files. And then on Thursday, we meet with MPs and senators on Parliament Hill. So these small teams, we did it for the first time last year. This will be our second annual. And we're specifically hoping that you might join us. We would be thrilled to have you. We'll help set everything up. And this is a chance for us to work together on building that political will for change in Canada. So with that, I'll wrap up and open for kind of questions and answers. But I also wanted to let you know, if you're interested in learning more about ORC, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. We can look at that together, especially in the French-speaking communities. Saying French, je suis disponible pour venir parler à vos communautés, soit en personne.
So I can come to speak to your communities in person to present our work. I'd be very happy to do this. So this being said, thank you very much.
Merci, Geneviève.
Thank you, Geneviève. So we're going to have a time of sharing, Q&A. I already have a question in the chat to start us off, I would say. And of course, you can ask your question in a language of your choice.
In both ways, in English or in French. Okay, but one language at a time. All right, so in the chat, Geneviève, it is possible to receive copies of religious congregations' corporate statements about COP, fossil fuels, etc. And the second one, it would help very much as we dialogue about possibilities. Is there, did these kind of documents exist? If yes, where do we can have them?
OK. Je vais parler en... Je vais juste quitter le partage d'écran.
Voilà, c'est fait.
Screen sharing. Okay. So I'll respond. I was going to continue in French because I was just speaking in English for a long time. There's work that was done by our group. They prepared a whole website with how changes can be an investment with religious communities or a family or a person. So there's a lot of resources that are available for communities. There's work also that has been done, very recently done, with ACOSI and ORC to prepare communications for the dioceses and to ask for a change of investments. Also, we would like share between religious communities as soon as we can, or put people in contact with one another on how they have succeeded in changing their investments. We all recognize also we're not trying to share amounts or details, technical details, but helping out with resource people available. Is Margot Ritchie. We commented on the Hill last year. She met the conference on divestment and presented people who are working on the finances for that community.
But essentially, one of their consultants was on the Hill presenting about a more fossil. I'm losing my train of thought. Fossil fuel. Yeah, shut and come out. When we were in Ottawa, we were attending a session with Rosa Galvez, who was talking about climate financing and aligning the finances in Canada, the banks in Canada, and all our funding with fossil fuel-free programs. At that time, we were able to put some connections to connect people with each other so that they could work on divestment together. Là, je vois que Danielle a partagé dans le chat un exemple du travail.
Danielle had put in the chat the Laudato Si movement also. Yes, that's what I was mentioning that. Thank you very much, Geneviève.
Maybe we can try to take a couple questions. Raise your hand. Si vous avez une question, levez la main en utilisant.
If you have a question, raise your hand using the hand in your reaction button. We'll try and take a few questions right now. Thank you, Geneviève, for your switching from English to French, even if it's demanding for other people. Thank you very much. It's very appreciated. So, as I said, you can ask the question in French or in English.
Ça peut être une question d'ordre plus général ou
It
peut-être
could be a general question or maybe part of the presentation that raise your interest and creates a concern for you. We have a little bit of time in front of us, so please be free to intervene.
Sinon, je vais partager un peu de mon expérience.
If not, Marie-Laure, somebody's asking. Hi, thank you. I have two questions. First question, that COP, speaking in French, is that okay? Is that okay? For COP28 is over with, I wanted to see what was going to happen in the follow-up. I was very surprised to find out that knowing the incoherence of having chosen Dubai to have COP28 and everything related to lobbying and things like the companies. So we there's another meeting which might be creating the same problem because with the fuel companies and who decides to these meeting places, especially if we continue in this direction, which really helps certain interests. So we're happy to see a COP30, but I think we have to really change everything, and we need to mobilize, and where it's possible, we have to do that. And the COP29, what are we hoping from it? What are we going to do? So that's one thing. And the other thing is, at the end, Genevieve, you proposed 2 or 3 dates quite quickly. And so I'm wondering, what is your project? Is this something you're going to renew? Are you really going to help to form people? This is really new in the church world to work in this field of advocacy. And so from this kind anyway, for me it was new. And I'm sort of saying, how can we still one-day training, how can we prepare ourselves? Because evidently, if we're not well prepared for this, we don't have any impact. There you have it. Good question. At the end of COP28, there were questions mostly on the upcoming one in terms of finding out what the next meeting would be like. There's two approaches. If there's no host country, the conference would be in German, in Bonn. So we had some COPs were in Bonn before. So if we don't, Dar es Salaam's not chosen, and then we'd go to Bonn. So from Dubai, Bonn, and then Brazil. So the difficulty with this certain inconsistency is that we're trying to seek a host country that would have the capacity to receive or welcome 80,000 or 85,000 people for a conference. So it was more visible that it's not a conference, which is a big party of everybody who would love to be part there in person. And so we found out that we're in a lobbying party situation. So there's questions around that. Some people think it would be better that it be in Bonn. We'd have less chance that it would become a lobbying conference for oil and gas. But as I said at the very beginning, there's 5 regions, and there's a choice between each of the 5 regions in the world, and it rotates Europe. My question when I looked at different places is that there were 5 regions, but in fact, Does it make sense that there be Asia Pacific? That's Dubai? No, that wasn't evident. But it shows also who's present, who wants to be there to take decisions, and who has the capacity to be there. And it really push. That means that we're acting more with the developed countries, more and have more chances to respond to the challenge. That's why I talked about Brazil, because there's also the World Social Forum there, the militancy, the work with the indigenous, the unions, all kinds of groups in Brazil that are really great, and we would need that in contribution also, and then we'd have a better chance of really mobilizing. What can I say? The anti-capitalistic world, and maybe there would be something that could come out of this. I also note on COP29, it would be 30 all questions around finances. So that's also important to discuss. When we look at the finances and the levels of finances, who does it help? The people who are impacted or what? Second question for Orsi. The Orsi, their office has only been there for 2 years now. So it's a very new project that just started by a couple of people from different religious communities who wanted to have more mobility, more possibilities in terms of having access to information to talk about the important issues. We do a lot of work in our about education, but we don't have the whole question of the advocacy and the impact with the MPs. So we need to look at these meetings and communications with the MPs. So the office is me alone right now, and we have a small team of 3 other people who help. And there is an executive committee, and there are 24 communities, or 24 congregations that reach us and work with us. Either give a VIF or members of the working with us on the board. We started the advocacy that we use for our meetings. We have letter programs when we write the MPs or the leaders. There's also possibilities in the future to prepare presentations, small meetings on the education of how to meet in the ring of lobbying. I'm mentioning this because it's more and more important now that we, citizens, faith people, we present ourselves on the hill with the MPs, because at this particular time, the number of people who are doing lobbying for corporations are enormous. I mean, 80% of the people who do lobbying on the Hill with our elected people are corporations. So the question is, do we want to be there? Do we want our opinions to be there? Is our message to be there? Will it be heard by our elected people who, if 80% of the people who are lobbying are from the gas or the oil companies? I mean, it's enormous. So we need to see a little how can we gather anybody? How could we have to get the religious communities to be part of this? So it's a project we believe in, the ORSI, and we hope that to work with people on this.
Thank you, Geneviève.
Thank you, Geneviève.
Read to you what Margot just write in the chat. The three organizers of this webinar are all national organizations that gather together religious congregation. Let's sponsor other webinars to prepare for a collective response for COP30. So I will switch to French. Je vais en profiter pour remercier les responsables.
I'd like to thank the people, the three organizations who have encouraged this webinar, today's activity, and the English constellation of the International Union of Major Superior, UISG, ORC, and of course, the CRC. And beyond the titles of their organizations, there are persons in there, among their leaders, the official leaders, and there are people who work in the field, as we say. So I'd like to say hello to Sister Margot at this time, who, for the promotion of these topics, these themes that are so important for all of us. Time is fleeing. I'd like to take another question in English. If somebody had a question in English, yes. So come back to it. I have a first screen. There's a lot of kinds of people. Sue Wilson, welcome. It's your turn.
Thank you. This is actually just a quick comment. I am the current chair of the board of ORC, and I wanted to pick up on the question about the advocacy in Ottawa. And yes, we certainly recognize that many of our religious communities don't have a lot of experience with legislative advocacy. And so what we do when we gather is we make sure that the three asks that we take to government are very clear, and we make sure that you understand the rationale behind each of the things we're asking government to do. And we will also ensure that with the small group, every small group that visits politicians, that there will be people in the group who can give some background information as well if that's necessary. So I think, if you ask people who have had the experience already, that they felt pretty comfortable speaking to the politicians.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Daniel, je vois que tu as demandé la parole. Je vais te mettre à l'écran dans un instant.
Daniel?
Merci Yves. Bonjour Geneviève. Merci.
Thank you, Yves, Geneviève. Thank you for this presentation. I'd like to ask a question or open an avenue in terms of coherence. You said that the virtual participation to COP28 was sufficient when there were 84,000 people in the field there. So I think there's an important coherency in a conference on climate changes when you have 84,000 to move with everything that this means in terms of impact. And it seems to me that the question of coherence, consistency, that people have COP meetings. And I think that it seems to me that when we talk about advocacy here in Canada, we should think not only of advocacy on the Hill, because even there we'll meet the same kind of inconsistency if we have to go to Ottawa when our MPs are in each one of our counties. So how can the office foresee training at a distance using technology to visit people, to work with the MPs, but in their counties? Then they don't have to move around too much. It's very minimum. There's certainly not great distances. So this is an addition I'd like to offer to see the consistency and the coherence of our commitments in terms of maintaining our values with what we're doing. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, very good idea. I really was surprised when I received my status as a company status. all kinds of documents I have to prepare. You're entering into the system of this, that, and that way, and you have a choice to watch or join. But I have to tell you, the whole conference, there was only watch. You could click and look. There was no place to join. I even tried to see with friends of the United Church of Canada, see what was possible. And if the guy said, "Did you get joined?" No, there was no possibility of joining the COP28. There was only could watch.
J'ai réalisé
And I realized that one reason why there was so little people there, or a lot of people there, it was a changing of the times. It was early in the morning, so to join the meetings. So I was like, even so, it was strange that there wasn't the chance to be able to join, because I followed all the process to be able to be a delegate in person or virtual delegate. And yes, I think that there is a change. We have seen also here in Canada, there's not all the members in Parliament who who live in Ottawa. And if we see each other on Chamber of Commerce, it's not full. They're not all there. We visited last year. It was evident that there was about 12 people who were there. There was a lot of people who were working remotely. So if the MPs are in their in their areas, I think it's a important time to be able to get to them. And I agree fully that it's an occasion that we can have, an opportunity that we can have. Sometimes I find it's important that we are together uh, for certain things when we meet, like, for example, the Minister of the Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, or Gary Wilkinson. Those are times that it's good to bring all the leaders together. But from one day to another, regularly, there's great opportunities to meet our parliament members in our circle, in our areas, in our regions. And I would be really happy to be able to share resources, whether it be written or a little talk, a pep talk, with the congregations to prepare them. These are people like us, and we come with our values and our suggestions, and they're there to listen to us. Oh.
Yeah, I'm sorry. All right, once again. Diane wrote, I wonder if ORC could contact religious order and maybe other churches when they are going to lobby a particular issue and ask for formal support. Yeah, sure.
Puis c'est fait. On utilise par exemple, sorry, I'll respond in English. I'll use, for example, recently we wrote a note to the Minister of the Environment to set up a meeting so that he could receive some of the petitions of the Citizens for Public Justice, the Lenten petitions for last year. So there we gathered all the church leaders together to really put in pressure to set up that meeting.
All right, and Joe Gunn wrote, the CCB wrote pastoral letters on environmental issues in 2003, 5, 13, then a letter to government in advance of COP15 and after the publication of La Russie, but not a word since. And not there an entire decade ago. When was the last CRC statement on climate issues? Can the CRC invite all our congregation to sign the FFNP treaty that Geneviève mentioned? Okay, Alain Ambo, Executive Director, is watching, so he take note of this question. Probably we'll come back with some answer later. Okay.
Those are good questions, especially, and I'll just flag this. The reason we are excited about the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is that it goes further than the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. Paris Agreement is still very general, and this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty gets really specific about the changes we need to make.
I just want to give one more chance, une dernière chance. Si vous avez une question, un commentaire que vous vouliez faire ce midi, c'est
If you have
votre
a comment or something you want to say today in the last 30 seconds, this is the fine countdown.
If you have something to say or to ask to Geneviève, go ahead. Durant cette attente, je pense
While
que
we're waiting, I think the objective that was today, not only to inform us, but I think it was also to initiate within us a reaction or a reflection. And I think we've attained this objective. There's a lot to do. And I think that it's just the beginning, Geneviève, with the clarity of the information that you gave and the openness. I was going to say the honesty that you had in your presentation, it came and gave us a desire to be more interested in this subject. And if with the help with the office with the ORC, we can find another way of participating. Because yes, of course, the advocacy, it's new. And for some people, and I think there's a follow-up that we can do to this. So in the name of the organization, Geneviève, thank you very much for your contribution. And I wish you a nice recovery, even though you seem really in shape, healthy. I think I followed, I lost a bit of what you were saying in French. I'm going to blame COVID for that. So thank you very much, everybody. I thank you, and we'll follow up with the different organizations, partners today. Of course, it's not done. It's only the beginning. So I wish you an excellent day wherever you are in the country, and see you soon. Bye.